Good morning, everyone, and all four departments. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Smitha Warrior. I'm with the Department of Anesthesiology, and we're all very excited to have this first series of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Grand Rounds. I just want to take a couple of minutes for some business or notes and introduce this group. As many of you know, the School of Medicine has really prioritized our work as an institution around equity, diversity, and inclusion in these next coming years. As part of that, they have asked every department to have a leadership group or person designated to work on these items. As you see before you, we have here Dr. Erica Bisson with neurosurgery, Dr. Kristen Carroll with orthopedics, Dr. Jeremiah Alt with surgery, and myself and Dr. Emily Hagan with the Department of Anesthesiology. Credit to Dr. Alt. He had the insight and thought that working together in the ORs is obviously a little bit of a different culture than some of the other areas in the hospital. And he created this little subgroup of EDI leadership within the School of Medicine to work together to try to get us to obviously collaborate, to learn together, and eventually hold each other accountable for our spaces and perioperative services surrounding this work. So we've had a really great time getting started. And one of the things that we've decided to do is what we're seeing today, which is a series of grand rounds and lectures focused on equity, diversity, inclusion. We'll have 4 this coming year with various speakers. Again, off topic of some of the things we normally talk about, but extremely important and really want to highlight and get us all to some place of getting educated and hearing this information together so that we can all work through it and get to a better place together. Along those lines, please feel free to reach out to any of us with questions, concerns, thoughts, ideas. We also will be sending out an email later this week. We have asked that anyone in the departments involved in interviews for residency or recruitment do implicit bias training. There are amazing sessions offered virtually and in multiple times to allow for engagement through the university surrounding implicit bias. But beyond those people, we think it's great for everyone to get involved and do this kind of work. So look for an email surrounding that later this week. For this lecture, we will be doing a Q&A at the end and hope to get some great discussion. Dr. Alt mentioned he and Dr. Carroll and Dr. Biss and myself will be looking at the chats to try to gather the questions that are asked during the lecture. And at this point, it is my honor to introduce our amazing speaker for today, Dr. William Smith. Dr. Smith is the current professor and chair here at the University of Utah in the Department of Education, Culture, and Society. Dr. Smith has had a prolific career that started in Illinois. His higher ed career started as a student athlete at Eastern Illinois. He played football. He also got his master's degree there and then went on to do his PhD at the University of Illinois. Dr. Smith has had a significant list of publications and work since then, as well as 2 postdoctoral fellowships. And really his career and his research has been centered around microaggression, critical race theory, and his work on racial battle fatigue, which we'll be hearing about later today, this morning. He has coined the term and is credited with the term racial battle fatigue and his work surrounding that. He has been awarded a significant number of accolades and awards and honors throughout his time, 2 of which I want to highlight just because I think it really gives the breadth of the work Dr. Smith does, and they both were received this year. He was the recipient of the 2021 Outstanding Research Award, of which there are only 3 given at the university to professors, highlighting his research surrounding the work he'll be discussing today. But he's also brings his work outside of academics and is a tremendous community member and is being honored at the Living Color Gala Award later this month. And that is hosted through the Utah Business as well as Salt Lake City Corporation for people who have really given back to their community. And Dr. Smith is being awarded for his work surrounding equity, diversity, inclusion, and social justice in the community of Greater Salt Lake and Utah in general. So again, he spans both academics and greater society with his work. I've had the honor of knowing and working with Dr. Smith for about the last few years with various work on main campus and athletics. And beyond his paper CV and strengths that I've just highlighted, he is an amazing person. He has always got a smile on his face. He's an amazing mentor. He also inspires confidence and strength wherever he goes. The only negative I have to say about him is he has some really questionable professional sports teams based on his time in Illinois. But besides that, on that note, I will hand this over to Dr. Smith, and we can't wait to hear your lecture. Dr. Smith?
Good morning, and thank you, Smither, for that. I'm happy to be here, and I see what the M in your MD must stand for. It's like early morning. You know, the PhD stands for perhaps. So, but I'm glad to be here to talk with you all. And I really want to get right into it because I might have to skip a few slides just to ensure that we have enough time to have a conversation. And let me see if this is set up correctly. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, hopefully you're just seeing one slide. Perfect. All right, so the title of this presentation is The Medical Significance for Understanding Racial Battle Fatigue. And I mean, I could have called it Closing the Empathy Gap in Medical Care. I think that's really one of the primary ways that we can get at reducing racism and reducing the responses to racism and the impact of racism is to increase that empathy among each other. And that's something that as we go through this presentation, you'll see how it's always under attack, even at an early age. So I have 3 goals for the presentation. I want you to obtain an understanding of the foundations of racial oppression and how it operates to cause racial battle fatigue. I want you to acquire a deeper sociological understanding, and I could have said social psychological understanding of what racial micro-level aggressions are and how they impact targets of white supremacy. Then learn how events cause biopsychosocial trauma, which leads to racial battle fatigue. Now, why do I study biopsychosocial effects of racism? I mean, it really goes back to my early years. My father was one of Dr. Martin Luther King's bodyguards, and Dr. King then assigned him as chief of security for Operation Breadbasket, which became Operation Push under the leadership of Reverend Jesse Jackson. So I grew up in Chicago during a time, and that's where Smither gets that questionable football choice from, but go Bears. So I grew up at a time where it was still going under Jim Crow attitudes and ideologies. If Black boys would ride their bikes across an imaginary line into the white neighborhoods, you could be stoned to death. And that happened multiple times in actually the older Mayor Daley's neighborhood. So I always looked at this and said, why? Why do they treat us like this? My father's on the road with Dr. King and then with Reverend Jesse Jackson, and we're still being treated like this. And I was a pretty sensitive kid at the time. This was before football, Smither. So before I became a linebacker, I was pretty sensitive to other people's pains. And I also was sensitive to understand how it was impacting me. And that's what drove me to psychology and why I started later on in my life picking up this kind of research. Now, just this year, my son, who is a CNA at Huntsman Cancer Institute, came home upset. This is my 23-year-old. And he said something happened. He had to work the night of the Super Bowl. And he said, while he was in a patient's room, the patient said, "Look at those monkeys celebrating." And all the other healthcare providers, the team, were right there and they didn't know what to say. They looked at him as if he was going to save the day or have some kind of negative reaction. But all he felt was embarrassed, disgusting, because he knew what that sentiment meant. So that's what happens oftentimes when you have these racial microaggressions. You're unprepared, you're not expecting it, and somebody lashes out at you or your group, and it just makes you freeze. Sometimes it makes you flight or fight. And he knew at the time he couldn't pull the plug on that cancer patient because the Smith family would have been in the newspapers with a lawsuit and he would have been in jail. So you have to negotiate your responses all the time, which also can be stressful. But where does this come from? We've been dealing with this for far too long, but it's embedded, it's baked into the fabric of our society. So if we go back to the Flexner Report, and I'm sure many of you are well aware, and let me pause for a moment to say that you can see the QR code on many of my screens. So if you want to take a picture with your smartphone, it'll take you right to the publications that I'm highlighting. I like to have people verify the evidence that I present so they know it's just not my imagination. But this Flexner Report basically was stratifying white groups and having Black groups at the bottom of admissions into medical programs. It was closing medical schools, and it only kept about 2 historically Black college universities medical schools. So what it was saying in his report is that Black people did not have the mental wherewithal to basically become doctors. This has to be something for the best people, irrespective of really, well, not irrespective, but it was the best people, and the best people were assigned to the white category. Now, this obviously is a holdover to the system or the systemic and scientific racism. And this goes all the way back earlier than 1851 with Dr. Samuel Cartwright. He's the person who diagnosed Africans enslaved in America as having drapetomania. Drapetomania was someone who was fleeing from enslavement had to be crazy. And what you would do with a person who was fleeing from enslavement was to beat them. You would have to work them hard. And it's the same thing for all of the kind of diagnosis that he had. You just had to make them work harder. And one of the ways that you would do this is you would oil them down, tie their arms and legs so that they spread apart, and then whip them 100 times with a cat of 9 tails. And that was supposed to stimulate the body and blood so that they would not want to run away and they would work hard for their master. So you can kind of see where we're coming from. But what I want you to really pay close attention to, if this was baked into the fabric of our society, when did we take it out? When did we work as hard to remove it from our psyche as it was put into it? Even in 1900, where you had Dr. Charles Carroll in this really famous book, The Negro, a Beast, or In the Image of God. It was in chapter 2 where he says in the opening paragraph, the white, the highest, and the Negro, the lowest of the so-called 5 races of men, present the strongest contrast to each other in their physical and mental characteristics. And that physical and mental characteristic is the kind of thread that runs through this type of scholarship all the way into the 1960s. But if we look at some of our most famous, or some might say infamous people, they all held these type of beliefs. Even Thomas Jefferson, He said blacks smell bad and were physically unattractive, required less sleep, were dumb, cowardly, and incapable of feeling grief. Advance it therefore as a suspicion only that blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstances, are inferior to the whites in the endowment of body and mind. One of the things that, being from the great state of Illinois, we hold or held Abraham Lincoln up very high, especially as a Black person. But the whole state, even on our license plates, it says the land of Lincoln. And it wasn't until graduate school that I learned that Lincoln was a white supremacist. He was against slavery, but he said that he, like every other white man, wants the advantage. The superior position should be given to the white and this inferior position to the Black. And we should never live together. The best we can do is to, what he basically was saying, is a repatriation act of sending him back to Africa. So while he was better than some, he still was a white supremacist. And that's something that many people from Illinois will fight you over until today. Now, I was influenced by three critical psychiatrists: Dr. George Engel, Dr. Chester Pierce, who was my mentor, and Dr. Bessel van der Kolk. The others here are also influences, but their research helps to pull together many of the things that we'll be talking about this morning. So what's important about Dr. Engel? Here, Dr. Engel is the one who advanced the biopsychosocial model. So if you look at the blue box, he says, believe that to be better, understand and help patients. Let me put my glasses on, it's early. All right. Believe that to be better, understand and help patients, clinicians must attend simultaneously to the biological, psychological, and social dimensions of health. That's really important. And that's the piece where I think we need to drum home, focus on that. He was against that kind of linear thinking. He wanted to include not just the physiological or the cognitive, but he wanted to look at what's happening in the society. And this brings us to Dr. Chester Pierce. Dr. Pierce is the person who gave us racial microaggression. He coined racial microaggression. Dr. Pierce was actually a graduate of Harvard, both as an undergrad and a med school. He had a joint appointment in the College of Education and the School of Medicine at Harvard. And it was in that piece in 1970 where he talked about the psychiatric problems of the Black minority. And it was this quote that really kind of caught my attention. The major and overriding psychiatric problem of the Black minority is the withering effect of racism. Hence, the social, cultural, and community aim must be to dilute, undercut, and eliminate racism wherever and however it is located. Now, in this, there's a movement going on that you have to really follow in this piece. He says the withering or weathering effect of racism. So he's telling you what is happening to the body when they deal with racism. And then he says that we must dilute, undercut, and eliminate racism wherever and however it is located. That's our marching orders. So, and that's been my pursuit, is to try to dilute, undercut, and eliminate racism and advance Dr. Pierce's work. Now we have Dr. Bessel van der Kolk. And these two pieces from his book, The Body Keeps the Score, are really important. He says, as long as you keep secrets and suppress information, you are fundamentally at war with yourself. The critical issue is allowing yourself to know what you know. That takes an enormous amount of courage. Being able to feel safe with other people is probably the single most important aspect of mental health. We have to have safe connections. People have to feel safe within their environment, whether it's their home, their workplace, out on the street. A little boy at the playground playing with a toy gun should not have to expect that a police car will roll up on him and within 2 seconds take his life without saying a word. You have to feel safe. If your body does not feel safe, it's going to always feel under attack. It cannot produce. You cannot educate it fully. And so that has to be one of our primary goals. And doing that, our empathy has to be, how do we see other people and their pain as our own? How do we see other people's histories as connected to us? And how can we do better so that we don't continue the bad parts of our history into the future? That comes with an understanding. Part of that understanding, as I started, was looking at the foundational and racial oppression of Blacks in the US. So if you just look at this chart, and let's say now Jamestown was founded in 1607. The first enslaved Africans were brought here in 1619. Slavery lasted until 1865. That's 64% of our history. So we still are operating with the majority of our history was under Black enslavement. Now there was this period, this 23% period of US history where 3% was the Black codes, what was near like enslavement, right? And then you had the Jim Crow laws following that in 1877 to 1969. If you look at some of the court cases, Brown versus the Board of Education, that was in 1950s. But it didn't come under complete, it didn't come under the complete court order following those rules that the court said until the late 1980s. So it wasn't in compliance until the late 1980s. Now, if you read Michelle Alexander's book, she talks about the new Jim Crow. So I used that to go from 1969 to really 2021, because what did we just see last summer? We saw on video recordings the killing of George Floyd and others, the things that Black people have been witnessing even before smartphones existed. So that's the part that we must come to understand, to empathize with, so that we can treat better the health of a community. Let's get rid of that. All right, let's talk about anti-Black racism and how I define it. Now, although I'm talking about anti-Black racism here, it's only as an example, because this can be used to talk about other marginalized groups. But anti-Black racism is an injurious and specific stressor that pose violent threats to the biological, psychological, physical, cultural, and social health and the associated interlocking identities of the Black person. So that means, I don't say intersectional because too often people decide when they want to talk about how it's intersected and when it's not intersected. It's always interlocked. So you can have anti-Black misogyny, anti-Black misandry, anti-Black queerness, anti-Black classism, anti-Black ableism, right? That is part of the whole experience of these people. Dr. Pierce started this and I pushed it since him, I took the ball and kept on running. But in 1970, actually in the 1960s, Dr. Pierce had already said that racism is a public health crisis. And I continued saying that in my work. And recently, the CDC, with this QR code, has also claimed that racism is a public health crisis. Now, a lot of times what happens is we look at the social determinants of health, and we say about 50% of that is based on what happens in a particular zip code. But it's way more to that. I believe it's the racial determinants of health. And we have to get in a little bit deeper to look at the social experience of Black and other marginalized and minoritized groups, because it's not telling us the full picture. The full picture is those unique experiences that they have based upon those interlocking identities. Once we do that, we'll understand that anti-Black racism is an act of violence. The body codes racism as a violent act. And that's what we're seeing come up into the hospitals when you diagnose it one way, if you don't consider the social part and what happens to the person. Fortunately, last year, we saw, and this is a picture from the U, some of our physicians carrying signs that say white coats for Black lives and white supremacy is a public health crisis. But I say here, to understand the mental and physical health conditions of Black people, we got to go back to Pierce. Medical professionals must recognize these withering or weathering effects of racism. And what are those? How do microaggressions operate? My good friend, Dr. Monica Williams, she talks about how this model of aggression and dominance plays out. And most of it is based on these kind of pathological stereotypes about people of color. Then that motivates racial bias or prejudice. And then you have this interracial anxiety. In much of my work, when I look at college students, I see this interracial anxiety where the police, either campus police or community police, are called on Black men because of their presence. And their presence elicits fear. They don't belong here. They're in the library, they're looking suspicious. They're in the computer room, they're looking suspicious. And they call campus security or call local police. That creates hostility and fear, the need to control the interracial encounter. And then these are commissions of a microaggression, and it has a direct offensive action to those people, right? So we have to learn much more about how microaggressions impact marginalized groups. When I talked about the empathy gap, unfortunately, the research suggests that there's a major change in the early years of our children. Children are born innocent, as we all know. At age 5, there is no empathy difference regarding pain. If they see one person getting a shot, they'll cry as if it was happening to them. But by age 7, we notice that something starts to happen. And there's a stronger bias that emerges. But by age 10, there is a significant and reliable bias developed that the Black child feels less pain than the white child. So if you have a free range son or daughter, right, and you don't start to teach them, or you don't stop them from seeing certain programs, overhearing certain programs on TV, even if you do the best parenting possible, society can teach them another lesson. And that's where my good friend, colleague, Dr. Robert Sapolsky talks about it. He says it's tribalism, and it's always been there. He says our brains evolved to make meaning out of the abstract or the unknown. So everything that we do, or most of what we do, is grounded in our own assumptions. We turn this world into the us's and the thems, as Dr. Sapolsky talks about. And he says we don't like the thems that much, but we exaggerate how great the us's are. So, University of Utah football team, that's the us's. BYU, we turn our thumbs down. I don't even remember what Smithers football team is because, okay, I think it's the New Orleans Saints only because my former teammate is the head coach of the Saints. So I feel like he's a us. The Saints are us with the Chicago Bears. But you can see on game day, the us's and thems are ready to fight. Green Bay Packers and the Chicago Bears fans, they'll fight harder in the stadium than the football players on the field. But this is universal behavior. It's happened all over the world. But Sapolsky's research tells us that within a 20th of a second, your brain is already responding to the us's and the thems. And the love drug doesn't work as what some people think. Oxytocin makes us have greater empathy for the in group. And we basically don't have the same level of support for the out group, right? But it can be easily manipulated. That's good and bad. So let's talk about targets of white supremacy as the doctors were holding those signs out there in front of their building. So what I've kind of reclassified some of the microaggressions are using Daryl Wing Sue's work, but expanding upon that. You have what he calls the microaggression. Well, Dr. Pierce started it off as microaggressions, but I say that the micro level invalidations and the micro level insults are at the bottom. Those are the things that we experience all the time. And then we get to micro level aggressions, which basically are all those experiences before that are just moving up. And then we have the micro level assaults, and that is an overt racist, physical, verbal, or nonverbal attack intended to cause harm. The thing that I add to this is an understanding of micro abuses. And racial micro abuses are repetitive, systemic, and collective actions of purposeful assaults, aggression, insults, invalidations with the intentions to oppress, manipulate, hurt, weaken, marginalize, frighten, or torture a racialized person or group. And it impacts them at the mental, physical, so the biological and physical levels. How does that kind of operate in our lives? Well, most of us know the taller you are, there tends to be some kind of social economic benefit to it. But that doesn't seem to be the case for Black men. In this study, one of the people said, who was interviewed, when you deal with the police, you must be careful. You are big and they will automatically see you as a threat. Now, Charles Coleman is 6'4". I'm 6'3". Within my first semester here as a professor, 20, going on 20, this is the beginning of my 23rd year, I was stopped by the police twice in the first semester. Once with a white colleague who had a hoodie on, and she says she doesn't believe they knew that she was white. They end up letting us go. I was driving her home. I parked right next to the curb of her house to drop her off. We went to grad school at Illinois together. And that's when the police came out. And she said that she was trying to use her whiteness to stop it. But I thought I was going to get shot in the back of the head because she jumped out the car and asked, "Officer, is there a problem?" And they said, "Ma'am, are you all right?" She said, "What's the problem, officer?" "Ma'am, are you all right?" 4 times they said this, right? And then they said, "We noticed he parked a little far from the curb." They followed us for over a mile. So these are the experiences that some of us don't see because they don't happen to us, or we don't have somebody who might look the way that the stereotype fits. And this table really shows that. It shows here, this is a study from New York, and you can see how often Black men are stopped and really frisked by the police versus other groups. So if I were to ask a white woman in New York, do the police harass people? She might innocently say no, because of her lived experience. I might even ask a Latina woman in New York. She might say no, or she might say, they do, but it's a lot of Latino men I know that get stopped. But if you ask Black men, what might their answer be? So this study gave us more evidence of how often Black residents in New York City were stopped by the police and frisked 8 times and 11 times more. So it's a different experience for Black people and brown people in New York City and in other cities across the country than it is for maybe from our other brothers and sisters. Now, I hope that you'll be able to hear the audio next. Smithy, if you can give me a thumbs up or down if you can't hear it.
All right. In the ground. Stop resisting. Stop resisting. Sir, you're on video. That's FYI. All right. Fine. I got covered. Yes, it's my beautiful sir. I was trying to put something on the roof. Okay, I have evidence. Okay, that in. Well, when we tell you to get down, you got to get down. Yes, sir. I understand. Okay. Then why am I being put in the handcuffs? We got to verify the car is not stolen. This is E4. Yeah, I'm a PhD student at Northwestern University in the Department of Materials Science and Engineering. I purchased this vehicle January 23rd, 2015 from Libertyville Chevrolet. I have all the evidence. That's all the registers. My phone. It registers. 7-3. Can you let someone who play registers too? No, I did not. There's something called the Fifth Amendment. No, okay. That doesn't apply. Yes, it does. Reasonable search and seizure. Hey, what's up?
Hi, I called.
Okay.
It looks like he had a bar in his hand and was trying to jimmy it open.
Okay.
I feel really good. I didn't mean to like racial profile. Just like
No.
like that.
All right.
And I don't want to like.
All right, man. Calm down.
I know.
Okay.
I just.
All right. He got a different issue going on right now. Let me see. Dan, want to get your information?
Yeah. No. Yeah.
Okay. I'll give it to you. Come to him. I think it's fine. Okay. I will get the information.
So what you basically saw was how they rushed him, and the officer in the red shirt was throwing blows and knees at him without even telling him why he was under arrest, right? I experienced the same thing as a doctoral student coming back home to Chicago from the University of Illinois, driving with one of my best friends in his car. And we saw the police following us for about a mile, right? And it was at night, and I didn't stop until we got to a gas station where it was well lit. And this is the treatment of too many Black men that I know and all across the country that I don't know that get reported, that police see them as something different and as a threat. And all he was doing was putting the rubber seal back on his window, right? Just like I have in my back window of my Buick. The seal is a little bit loose. And that's what the woman thought he was jimmying a car to unlock it and steal it. Fortunately for Dr. Crosby, he settled for $1.25 million. The research is really strong, and it shows that Black men who report higher numbers of lifetime police stops have 3 times greater odds of what they call PTSD symptoms and what I would call racial battle fatigue. And Black women have 2 times greater odds. I think we have time for me to show this quick.
Tonight, a country emerging from protests of pain. After the killing of George Floyd,
I cannot breathe.
viral moments of racial bias caught on tape.
I'm going to tell them there's an African-American man threatening my life.
And the deadly shooting of Ahmaud Arbery. Incidents that are not just emotionally devastating, but also physically damaging to Black people.
Every police shooting of an unarmed Black person leads to worse mental health for the entire Black population in the state in which it occurred for the next 3 months.
Several studies show a possible association between perceived discrimination and mental and physical health. One study found that Black people who were stopped several times by police were 3 times more likely to exhibit symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder and high levels of anxiety and stress. We had a candid discussion about the toll those experiences can take.
Here we are again seeing Black people, Black men especially, being killed in public. It's a spectacle.
Do you feel exhausted by the headlines?
And it's an exhaustion that should not be seen as an exaggeration. It's an exhaustion that should be seen as justified, and that there is a real and a true understanding of why it's there.
That exhaustion, the byproduct of racism that dates back centuries, from slavery to Jim Crow segregation. It's a history of oppression that still impacts Black communities today, especially when images of brutality serve as a reminder.
How does that stress manifest? What does that mean for the Black people in this country who are watching those videos?
It means that they have higher levels of mental health symptoms. It means they have more difficulty sleeping at night. It means that some of their biological systems are not functioning the way that they should.
Causing a collective pain, but behind it, there's still hope.
Moving forward, I think we can continue to tell the truth, and hopefully America looks at itself and doesn't like what it sees.
We have to make sure that Black people, Black babies, Black children are protected.
Hope for a better future and a healthier one. Morgan Radford, NBC News.
Hey, NBC News fans, thanks for
Tonight.
Right, and this is just one of the publications that they cited about the kind of spillover effect. Now, I don't call it post-traumatic stress disorder because we're not in a post-racist society. These things are continuing to happen daily. But one of the nice things about this piece is that it talks about how long after a major event Black people are dealing with kind of mental health issues. One of the key findings, though, is that it collectively could be 55 million excess poor mental health days per year for Black adults. In a recent study by some professors here at the University of Utah, it didn't just have to happen in the state which it occurred for Black people to feel this way. They said that a high-profile killing can impact Black people across the United States. And my family is a testimony to the situation with George Floyd. Headaches, insomnia, frustration, all of these physiological symptoms, these emotional and behavioral things that we were dealing with. And then it didn't help matters that Benjamin Crump legal team called me to ask if I could be an expert witness for the family against the state. And so then I felt like I was being, the insomnia for me lasted for quite a while as I was trying to get ready for this, but fortunately they settled and I didn't have to testify. Dr. Williams says, just imagine a fully loaded jumbo jet with 220 passengers and crew taking off and crashing today. And the same thing happens every day for the rest of the year. That's the premature deaths that we have with Black people based upon racism. And I'll quickly move through this one. And this is just mortality statistics on babies, infant mortality, because I know our time is running. And I won't show you this one. I want to stop here. Black women who said that they face daily racism, daily racial microaggressions were 2.75 more times likely to demonstrate lower subjective cognitive functioning. And those Black women who said they experienced institutionalized racism was 2.66 times more likely to experience lower subjective cognitive functioning. So this memory loss, Alzheimer, all these other things that might be occurring for these Black women might be misdiagnosed if you do not understand the biopsychosocial aspect of their lives. But if you can name your pain, you can develop effective strategies for resistance and resilience. I know it's a lot of words here, so let me help. Racial battle fatigue is really a systemic racism-related repetitive stress injury. Racial battle fatigue is a psychological, emotional, physiological overload. So this is a race-related stress appraisal that is taxing, exceeding available coping strategies and resources. It's a disturbed person, environmental, racist relationship. Some of the things that you will see coming out of the symptoms of racial battle fatigue, the cognitive ones, frustration, defensiveness, apathy, irritability, the emotional ones, stereotype threat, John Henryism or high effort coping, imposter syndrome, quickness to argue, procrastination, increase of use of alcohol and drugs or smoking, or withdrawal from others, the physiological, headaches, grinding teeth, clenched jaws, chest pains, pounding heart, indigestion, gastric distress. So all of these things are what we've been able to find that makes up racial battle fatigue. Now, you can become an effective ally by 4 things: awareness, acceptance, assurance, and action, right? Awareness of the problem, understanding that it happens, assurance, which is a commitment, and then be a verb, have action. Now, for those people who are dealing with racial battle fatigue, we have to have trauma-informed care. There's the pill for my doctors. We have to realize, recognize, respond, and resist. Realize what we're dealing with. Recognize the signs and symptoms of racial battle fatigue in oneself, their family, and group members. Respond by fully committing to strength-based, asset-based strategies that are based on healthy ethnic racial identity development, and then resist individual, institutional, and systemic efforts at racial re-traumatization. And that could come through protective, proactive, and adaptive coping. I'll give you a second if you want to take a picture of this, or I know it's recording. So some of the sources. And a second page of sources. And thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Smith, for an amazing lecture. I think we'll see if Jeremiah has any questions in the chat. I'm going to start off with one. And since we know each other, I can be candid about this. But I think it's hard in a space, especially to be honest, like Utah, our demographics are very different than most of the country. Our medical and healthcare system demographically is very different than the rest of the country. It's very difficult to talk about the word racism. I think people don't identify with that word easily or well. And so it's very offensive to some, it creates defensiveness. How do we get past language to really work on that first step that you highlighted, which is awareness?
Right. What I've found is those people who are the most resistant, once they have good evidence, good information, and it's presented in a way that you're not threatening them or saying this is you who are doing this, but how it operates within a system. And so when we see those things, it could be even homophobic type of things or things against women that are sexist. If we don't step in to stop, right, when we see it occurring, then we contribute to the fact that that environment becomes poor for people who might be members of the LGBTQ community, or for people who are women, or for racialized, minoritized people. But obviously, most people, because of how we've been taught in this society to, you don't talk about that. We don't deal with that. CRT or systemic racism is anti-American. So people believe that like it's an attack on our country. This information is helping our country and the people within it to be better. It's community health that we need. And you have to deal with truth. It's everybody's story, whether it's from the Holocaust to the Mormon pioneers who were poorly treated in my state of Illinois that moved here to the West, any group's history. We have to appreciate and understand it from their own telling so we can do better. And I think that's just part of how you start.
Thank you. Jeremiah, do you have any questions that have come through, or Erica?
I do see a question in the chat from Alexander Colonna. The question is, where is the hope that any of this will get better? Feels like half the population is on board, and we all know which halves I'm talking about, and is active in this work, and the other half is actively resisting despite a preponderance of evidence that directly contradicts their worldview. So it's really about hope.
Well, hope is a great thing. I have a study on Black men, a national study on Black men, a quantitative study. And those Black men who have high hope actually have increased racial battle fatigue. Those Black men who have low hope have decreased racial battle fatigue. But their hope basically is defined almost like the lawyer Derek Bell talks about it. It's this racial realism. That's not the hope that we're talking about here. The hope is how can our country and the people inside of it be better and do better? And I think really it's going to come down to, unfortunately, a few more social demonstrations before people get on board and say, we got to stop this. It has to stop. People are going to get frustrated by not being able to live a comfortable life and feel safe, and that their neighbors are feeling as safe as them. But there are some hard-nosed folks that listen to, other information, and they don't believe any of this occurred. Anytime a state can say that slavery was voluntary workers, right? Some people say the history is written by the winners. Something like that. That's not always true, because the South so-called lost, but most of those textbooks come out of the South. and they write their own history.
Jeremiah.
We have a few more questions too, and you can see those down on the chat, Dr. Smith. But I guess one of the next questions was about how do we respond to patients when they make comments similar to what you presented with your son, that the football players were celebrating like monkeys, and I guess asking for some techniques, some wisdom around that, because we get that. I think we all get that a decent amount.
Yeah, and I presented to Cornell Medical, and many of them said the same thing, that some of the physicians, nurses, and others always are dealing with these racial microaggressions. So I believe that oftentimes, especially if it's more than two people in there, the person who wasn't supposed to be the target of the racial microaggression should say something, right? Just step in, say, no, that's not how we talk here. Now, if you want to go to another hospital or whatever, we can make arrangements, but we don't do that. But you have to say something. You have to stop it, because most of us aren't prepared to deal with that, because we don't talk about what if this happens and have scenarios written up. What is our response? So when I was in high school, I was a freshman in algebra trig. I was, tested advanced, and I was sitting in like the second row, and there was a white male student in the fourth row, right in front of the teacher, but about 3 seats back. He had a piece of paper, and he shot it into the garbage can, but it missed. And he asked the woman, the young girl in the seat at the head of that row, she said, "Will you pick that up and throw it away for me?" And she turned around and said, "What do I look like, your nigga?" And the class went quiet. And then everybody looked at me. I was the only Black in algebra trig. The teacher didn't say a word, right? So a predominantly white class, only one Black person in it. This person says that, right? So what is my experience going to be like for the rest of that semester? So we have to train these people that would, just like, you all are expert at what you do. So if something happens, we can get the best healthcare in a crisis or an emergency, but that's an emergency too. So we have to have an emergency response based upon racial microaggressions. We have to practice it enough. If this happens, this is our response. So it's just like a muscle reaction. And too often what we do is freeze. And then when we freeze, we make the situation worse.
I think we have time for at least one more question, maybe just one. But our next question is, what steps do you think trainees in healthcare can be taking to be actively anti-racist in a deeply hierarchical training system? And I think this speaks to many areas, but particularly in medicine and in residency training, that feeling of hierarchy, and how do you approach that when you are experiencing this?
I actually believe that we should have classes like this, and it doesn't have to be a whole semester or however you operate up there. But I remember about 20 years ago, maybe 17 years ago, there was a he was a MD, and he dealt with I think facial rashes and stuff like that, a Black man. And he asked me to come and work with the third year students to just have basically this for a longer period of time. And everything I presented, but I went more into the kind of medical side of it, a little heavier. They said they never got it, and they never made that connection. And I was doing it for probably 3 years. But I think more opportunities to hear, understand, pull that information together will prepare them to say, okay. And it's just like when I got LASIK, Dr. Mustafa, he was the chief surgeon here at Moran. And he came in, he had 3, I guess, residents with him. And he was saying, look at Dr. Smith's eyes. And he was talking about some dark spots. He said, people with a lot of melanin, like Dr. Smith and myself, you have to look for these and you got to make some kind of calculation. I don't know the medicine behind that, right? But I said, Dr. Mustafa, does that mean race matters? And he said, I'm glad you said that. It does, because you can make mistakes. Most of what we know is by operating on whites and Asians who have lighter melanin, lighter pigmentation, but we have to make certain kind of calculations. Dr. Mustafa was great for that moment and that lesson that those 3 white men could experience. But he would be great for a Black person who was one of them, because they would have been taught that not to look for that. And so I just think that having people who can speak to a diverse experience of people make you more valuable, because you bring in critical thinking skills that can be able to be employed throughout a system and make everybody better.
Well, I think we are out of time. I appreciate so much, Dr. Smith, you being here with us and sharing your wisdom and knowledge. I wish we could do, an extended series. And, I think you've given us some really good ideas to think about. From a curriculum standpoint, Dr. Nrula just pointed out, what are our institutional policies on things to support our physicians, our nurses, and our staff speaking up when these things happen. So we'll look into all those things. I think there's some great ideas, but thank you so much for your time. This has been a really amazing opportunity for us to hear from an expert in the field and to start our journey as surgical services and peri-op for a really hopeful and productive journey for our patients and ourselves.
Well, anything for you, Smithy.
Thank you. All right, we'll be in touch. Thank you all for being here today.
All right.
Thanks, Dr. Smith.
Thank you, Dr. Smith.
Thank you.